A new student. The Galactic University of Enlightenment gleamed like a beacon of hope amidst the cosmos, its spires reaching towards distant stars as if to embrace the future. Within its halls, a diverse array of species from across the universe gathered to learn the ways of peace, diplomacy, and cooperation. Professor Zodloff glided into the classroom, his crystalline exoskeleton refracting the soft light. The Azurian had dedicated his long life to teaching interspecies conflict resolution, guiding generations of students in the art of fostering harmony between even the most disparate of cultures. As the students settled into their teapods, excited murmurs filled the room. Today, a new classmate would be joining them, a rare Deathworlder exchange student from the distant planet Earth. Anticipation and apprehension mingled in the air, like the scent of exotic spices. The door slid open with a hydraulic hiss, and a figure strode in, his heavy footfalls echoing on the metallic floor. Jack's rider was an imposing sight, his muscular frame encased in a form-fitting black bodysuit that seemed to absorb light. His chiseled features and piercing blue eyes scanned the room, assessing potential threats with the instinctive wariness of an apex predator. "Welcome, Jack's rider," Professor Zoloth said, his melodic voice resonating through the universal translator. "We are honored to have a representative from Earth join our class. Please, take a Xi-Teapod." Jax nodded curtly and settled into a reinforced Xi-Teapod, the furniture creaking under his weight. The alien students eyed him warily, some unconsciously leaning away as if repelled by an invisible force field of barely contained aggression. Professor Zoloff began his lecture, his holographic displays weaving a tapestry of historical conflicts and their peaceful resolutions. Jax listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. As the lecture progressed, however, a frown began to tug at the corners of his mouth. "Professor," Jax said, his deep voice cutting through the hushed classroom like a blade, "with all due respect, do you really believe these methods would work on all species? What about those who only respect strength and view peace as weakness?" The room fell silent, the alien students exchanging nervous glances. Professor Zoloff paused, his crystalline face unreadable. "Jax, the path of peace is not an easy one, but it is the only way forward for a harmonious galaxy. Violence begets only more violence." Jax leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Sometimes, Professor, violence is the only language certain species understand. Hoping for peace won't protect you when someone comes to take what's yours." A murmur rippled through the classroom, a mixture of shock and fascination. Professor Zoloff's exoskeleton shimmered, betraying his agitation. "I assure you, Jax, our teachings have a proven track record of fostering understanding between even the most belligerent of species." Jax's smile held no warmth. "Then let me offer a demonstration of how conflicts are handled where I come from. Maybe it will shed some light on why your methods won't always work." Professor Zoloff hesitated, torn between his desire to maintain classroom decorum and his curiosity about the Deathworlder's perspective. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very well, Jax, please, enlighten us." As Jax rose from his teapot, the alien students shrank back, suddenly realizing that their peaceful classroom was about to be transformed into something far more primal and dangerous. Challenging assumptions, Jax strode to the front of the classroom, his movements fluid and precise, like a coiled spring ready to unleash its potential energy. He surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on each student as if sizing them up for a fight. "On Earth," Jax began, his voice low and intense, "we have a saying, si vis pacem, para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war." A confused murmur rippled through the alien students. Professor Zoloff's crystalline exoskeleton shimmered, a sign of his unease. "Jax," the professor said carefully, "while we respect your culture's perspective, the Galactic University of Enlightenment teaches that true peace can only be achieved through understanding and diplomacy." Jax's smile held a hint of condescension. "And how well has that worked out for you, Professor?" How many of your graduates have found themselves at the mercy of a species that doesn't share your enlightened views? Professor Xyloth's holographic displays flickered, historical data streaming across the screens. Our methods have resolved countless conflicts peacefully, Jax. The data speaks for itself. Jax shook his head. Data can be manipulated, Professor. And even if your methods work most of the time, what about the times they don't? What happens when you encounter a species that only respects strength? The alien students shifted uncomfortably in Therxy teapods, the Deathworlder's words striking a chord of primal fear in their hearts. Professor Xyloth drew himself up to his full height, his crystalline form refracting the light in a dazzling display. We cannot stoop to the level of our aggressors, Jax. Violence only breeds more violence. Jax's eyes narrowed, and passivity in the face of aggression only breeds extinction. Trust me, Professor, I've seen it happen. The room fell silent, the weight of Jax's words hanging heavy in the air. Professor Xyloth's holographic displays dimmed, as if the very light of knowledge was being smothered by the shadow of the Deathworlder's presence. What would you have us do, Jax? Professor Xyloth asked, his melodic voice tinged with a note of challenge. Abandon our principles and take up arms against any species that threatens us. Jax shook his head. No, Professor. I'm not saying you should become warmongers, but you need to be prepared to defend yourselves and your way of life. Hoping for the best is not a strategy. The alien students murmured among themselves, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in disapproval. Professor Xyloth's exoskeleton shimmered, a kaleidoscope of conflicting emotions. And how would you propose we prepare ourselves, Jax? The professor asked, his tone measured but curious. Jax's smile held a glint of something dangerous. Let me show you, Professor. Let me give you a taste of what real conflict looks like. As the Deathworlder began to move, the alien students leaned forward in their teapods, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. Professor Xyloth watched, his crystalline face unreadable, as Jax Ryder prepared to challenge everything the Galactic University of Enlightenment stood for. The demonstration. With a swift, fluid motion, Jax Ryder unzipped his black bodysuit, revealing a tight-fitting tank top that accentuated his muscular physique. The alien students gasped, some averting their eyes in shock at the display of raw primal power. The first rule of combat, Jax said, his voice low and intense, is to always be ready. You never know when an attack might come. He dropped into a combat stance, his feet shoulder-width apart, his hands held loosely at his sides. The alien students watched, transfixed, as the Deathworlder began to move. Jax's movements were a blur of speed and precision, his body a weapon honed by years of training and experience. He lashed out with a series of lightning-fast punches and kicks, his fists and feet slicing through the air with a whistling sound. The alien students flinched, some letting out involuntary yelps of fear as Jax's attacks came perilously close to Therxy teapods. Professor Xyloth watched, his crystalline exoskeleton shimmering with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The second rule of combat, Jax continued, his breathing steady despite the intense physical exertion, is to never underestimate your opponent. Even the weakest-looking species can be deadly if you let your guard down. He whirled around, his eyes locking onto a small insectoid student who had been trying to make herself invisible in the back of the room. With a lightning-fast movement, Jax lunged towards her, his hand stopping just inches from her quivering antennae. The insectoid student let out a high-pitched squeak of terror, her compound eyes wide with fear. Jax held his position for a moment, his gaze intense, before slowly withdrawing his hand. The third rule of combat, he said, his voice taking on a note of grim finality, is to always be prepared to do whatever it takes to survive. Hesitation can be the difference between life and death. He turned back to face the class, his eyes sweeping over the alien students like a predator sizing up its prey. Some of the students shrank back in Therxy teapods, while others leaned forward, their expressions a mix of fear and morbid fascination. Professor Zyloff stepped forward, his holographic displays flickering with agitation. Jax, while we appreciate your demonstration, I must remind you that the Galactic University of Enlightenment is a place of learning, not a combat training facility. Jax's smile held a hint of challenge. With all due respect, Professor, your students need to learn how to defend themselves and their way of life. Diplomacy and understanding are all well and good, but they won't save you when the shooting starts. The alien students murmured among themselves, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in disapproval. Professor Zoloth's exoskeleton shimmered, a kaleidoscope of conflicting emotions. "And what would you have us do, Jax?" the professor asked, his melodic voice tinged with a note of resignation. "Abandon our principles and become warriors like you." Jax shook his head. "No, Professor, but you need to be prepared to fight for your principles when the time comes. And trust me, that time will come." He turned back to the class, his gaze intense. "Who among you is willing to stand up and defend your way of life? Who among you has the courage to face the darkness and emerge victorious?" For a moment, the room was silent, the alien students looking at each other with uncertainty and fear. Then, slowly, a single hand rose into the air, trembling slightly with the weight of its owner's decision. A reluctant volunteer. All eyes turned to the source of the raised hand, a slender, ethereal being with translucent skin and delicate, gossamer wings. Xylar, a Lumari from the planet Aurelia, stood up from Thirxie Teapot, their iridescent eyes fixed on Jax with a mixture of fear and determination. I object to this display of aggression," Xylar said, their voice soft but steady. "The Galactic University of Enlightenment is a place of peace and learning, not violence and intimidation." Jax's smile held a glint of amusement. "Is that so? And what would you do, little Lumari, if someone threatened your peace? Would you talk them to death with your pretty words?" Ziller's wings fluttered, a sign of agitation. "Violence is never the answer, Jax Ryder. It only breeds more violence and suffering." Jax took a step toward Zillar, his muscular frame dwarfing the delicate Lumari. "And what if violence is the only language your enemy understands? What if they don't care about your suffering?" Zillar stood their ground, their iridescent eyes shining with a fierce light. "Then we must find another way. We must be better than our enemies, not sink to their level." Jax's smile widened, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Bold words, little Lumari, but let's see how well they'd hold up in the face of a real threat." With a lightning-fast movement, Jax lunged towards Zillar, his hand outstretched as if to grab the Lumari by the throat. Xylar let out a gasp of fear, their wings flaring out in a desperate attempt to evade the Deathworlder's grasp. But Jax's hand stopped just inches from Zillar's throat, his fingers hovering in the air like the claws of a great beast. The Lumari stood frozen, their iridescent eyes wide with terror, as Jax leaned in close, his breath hot against their delicate skin. "You see, little Lumari," Jax whispered, his voice low and dangerous. "Words are meaningless in the face of raw power. If I wanted to, I could crush you like a bug right now, and there would be nothing you could do to stop me." Zillar trembled, their gossamer wings quivering with fear. But even in the face of certain destruction, the Lumari refused to back down. "You may have the power to destroy me, Jax Ryder," they said, their voice barely above a whisper, "but you will never have the right. And that is the difference between us." For a moment, Jax's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise crossing his chiseled features. Then, slowly, he withdrew his hand, a grudging respect dawning in his gaze. "You've got guts, little Lumari," he said, his voice tinged with a note of admiration. "I'll give you that." Professor Zyloff stepped forward, his crystalline exoskeleton shimmering with relief. "Xylar's bravery is a testament to the strength of our principles, Jax," he said, his melodic voice tinged with pride. "Violence may seem like the easy answer, but it is never the right one." Jax shook his head, a rueful smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You may be right, Professor. But in a galaxy full of predators, sometimes the only way to survive is to become one yourself. As Zila returned to Therxy Teapot, their delicate wings trembling with the aftershocks of their brush with death, the alien students looked at Jax with a new sense of wariness and respect. The Deathworlder had shown them the brutal reality of the universe beyond their peaceful classroom, and they knew that they would never see the galaxy in quite the same way again. Rethinking peace. Professor Xylot's holographic displays flickered to life, casting a soft, pulsing glow over the classroom. The alien students sat in Therxy teapods, their expressions a mix of fear, confusion, and contemplation. Jack's writer's demonstration has certainly given us much to think about. The professor began, his melodic voice tinged with a note of weariness. But I must remind you all that the path of peace is not an easy one. It requires strength, courage, and unwavering commitment in the face of adversity. Jax, who had returned to his reinforced teapot, leaned forward, his piercing blue eyes fixed on the professor. With all due respect, Professor, your students need more than just pretty words and good intentions to survive in this galaxy. They need to be prepared to defend themselves and their way of life. A murmur rippled through the classroom, some of the alien students nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in disapproval. Professor Xyloth's exoskeleton shimmered, a kaleidoscope of conflicting emotions. "And what would you have us do, Jax?" the professor asked, his holographic displays flickering with agitation. "Abandon our principles and take up arms against any species that threatens us." Jax shook his head, a grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "No, Professor, but you need to understand that hoping for peace doesn't guarantee safety in a dangerous galaxy. Sometimes you have to be willing to fight for what you believe in." Zalar, the brave Lumari who had stood up to Jax earlier, raised a delicate hand. "But isn't that the very thing we're trying to avoid?" they asked, their iridescent eyes shining with conviction. "If we resort to violence, aren't we just perpetuating the cycle of conflict and suffering?" Jax's gaze softened, a flicker of respect crossing his chiseled features. "You're right, little Lumari. Violence should always be a last resort. But sometimes it's the only resort you have." Professor Xylot's holographic displays dimmed, as if the very light of knowledge was being smothered by the shadow of the Deathworlder's words. "Jax, I understand your perspective, but we cannot simply abandon our teachings at the first sign of danger. The Galactic University of Enlightenment has a proud history of fostering peace and understanding between species." Jax leaned back in his teapot, his muscular arms crossed over his chest. "And how many of those species have turned on you when push came to shove, Professor? How many of your graduates have found themselves at the..." Jax leaned back in his teapot, his muscular arms crossed over his chest. "And how many of those species have turned on you when push came to shove, Professor? How many of your graduates have found themselves at the mercy of an enemy who doesn't share your enlightened views?" The room fell silent, the alien students exchanging uneasy glances. Professor Xyloth's crystalline exoskeleton shimmered, a ripple of uncertainty passing through his ancient frame. I don't have those numbers readily available, Jax," the professor admitted, his melodic voice tinged with a note of hesitation. "But I maintain that our teachings have value, even in the face of adversity." Jax's smile held a hint of sadness. "I'm not saying your teachings are worthless, Professor, but they're not enough on their own. Your students need to be prepared for the worst, even as they hope for the best." He turned to face the class, his piercing blue eyes sweeping over the alien students like a searchlight. "How many of you have ever been in a real fight? How many of you know how to defend yourselves if diplomacy fails?" A few tentative hands rose into the air, but most of the students remained still, their expressions a mix of fear and uncertainty. Jax nodded, as if he had expected this response. "That's what I thought. You've been taught to rely on words and goodwill, but the galaxy is a harsh and unforgiving place. Sometimes, the only way to protect what you love is to fight for it." Professor Xyloth's holographic displays flickered, historical data streaming across the screens. But at what cost, Jax? How many lives have been lost in the name of fighting for what one believes in? Jax's expression hardened, a shadow passing over his chiseled features. Too many, Professor. But how many more lives have been lost because people were too afraid or too unprepared to stand up for themselves? The alien students murmured among themselves, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in disapproval. Xylar, the brave Lumari, stood up once more, their gossamer wings shimmering in the soft light of the classroom. "What would you have us do, Jax Rider?" they asked, their voice soft but steady. "How can we find a balance between peace and strength?" Jax's smile held a glimmer of hope. "That's the question, isn't it, little Lumari? And I think the answer lies in understanding both sides of the equation. We must strive for peace, but we must also be prepared to defend it when necessary." As the Deathworlder's words hung in the air, the alien students looked at each other with a new sense of understanding and determination. They had come to the Galactic University of Enlightenment to learn the ways of peace, but now they realized that true peace required something more: the strength and courage to stand up for what they believed in, even in the face of adversity. Strength and wisdom. The classroom buzzed with a newfound energy, the alien students whispering among themselves as they grappled with the implications of Jax Rider's words. Professor Xyloth's holographic displays pulsed softly, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the room. Jax stood at the front of the class, his muscular frame exuding a quiet strength. "I want to make one thing clear," he said, his deep voice cutting through the chatter like a blade. "I'm not advocating for mindless violence or aggression. I believe in peace, just like all of you." The alien students looked at him with a mix of surprise and confusion. Xylar, the brave Lumari, tilted their head, their iridescent eyes shining with curiosity. "But you said," they began, their voice trailing off as Jax held up a hand. "I know what I said, little Lumari, and I stand by it. But true strength isn't just about being able to fight. It's about knowing when to fight, and more importantly, when not to." Professor Xyloth's crystalline exoskeleton shimmered, a ripple of understanding passing through his ancient frame. "Jax is right," he said, his melodic voice tinged with a note of wisdom. "A truly enlightened species must understand both the value of peace and the necessity of strength." Jax nodded, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Exactly, Professor. And that's why I'm offering to teach your students some basic self-defense techniques. Not so they can go out and start fights, but so they can protect themselves and their way of life if the need arises." The alien students murmured among themselves, some looking eager, others apprehensive. Professor Xyloth's holographic displays flickered, historical data streaming across the screens. I suppose there is value in being prepared," the professor said, his voice hesitant but hopeful. "But I must insist that any such training be strictly voluntary and focused on defense rather than aggression." Jax's smile widened, a glint of approval in his piercing blue eyes. "Of course, Professor. I wouldn't have it any other way." As the Deathworlder began to outline his proposed training regimen, Xylar stood up once more, their gossamer wings fluttering with excitement. "I volunteer," they said, their voice strong and clear. "I may not be a warrior, but I am willing to learn how to defend myself and my people." Jax looked at the little Lumari with a newfound respect, his chiseled features softening into a genuine smile. "I'd be honored to teach you, Xylar, and anyone else who's willing to learn." Slowly, tentatively, other hands began to rise throughout the classroom, the alien students emboldened by Xylar's bravery and Jax's words. Professor Xyloth watched with a mix of pride and trepidation, his ancient exoskeleton shimmering with the weight of the moment. "Very well," the professor said, his melodic voice ringing out through the classroom. "Let it be known that from this day forward, the Galactic University of Enlightenment will offer basic self-defense training to any student who wishes to learn. But let it also be known that this training is meant to enhance our understanding of peace, not to replace it." As the alien students nodded in agreement, Jax and Ziller exchanged a look of mutual respect and understanding. They had come from different worlds, different cultures, but they had found common ground in their desire to protect what they held dear. And as the soft light of the classroom faded into the endless expanse of the cosmos, the students of the Galactic University of Enlightenment knew that they had taken the first step towards a new kind of enlightenment, one that embraced both the strength of the warrior and the wisdom of the peacemaker. The end.